the conservation strategies and the use strategies need to be equitable for them to be durable long term. And we see that in the United States all the time as the politics for or against conservation shift, right? They can shift sort of with generations, they can shift with political parties, they can shift for a lot of different reasons, but they're not very durable because there isn't that sort of alignment on vision, values, and ethics. But part of that's because there just isn't equity in the system as we've designed it today.
And how critical is equity to that durability?
I think it's absolutely critical. People aren't vested in sort of the decisions that translate themselves to policies and market conditions, land use plans and designations, and on down the line. If people aren't vested in that, and particularly if they see themselves as losing out, they fight against it.
These are stories of outdoor adventure and expert advice from folks with calloused hands. I'm James Nash, and this is the Six Ranch Podcast. The Six Ranch Podcast is brought to you by Sig Sauer. SIG is a leading provider and manufacturer of firearms, electro-optics, ammunition, air guns, and suppressors. For over 250 years, Sig Sauer Inc. has evolved and thrived by blending American ingenuity, German engineering, and Swiss precision. Today, Sig Sauer is synonymous with industry-leading quality and innovation, which has made it the brand of choice amongst the U.S. military, the global defense community, law enforcement, competitive shooters, hunters, and responsible citizens. Sig Sauer is also a premier provider of elite firearms instruction and tactical training at the Sig Sauer Academy located in New Hampshire. For more information about Sig Sauer and its complete line of products, visit sigsauer.com. So we talked yesterday about your family farming for 22 generations in Norway. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that takes us 600 years back?
Yeah.
How does that cycle get broken? That's what I've been thinking about. You would think that if a family did a thing for that long, that it would go forever.
I think lots of families would like to believe that it will and that it should.
Yeah.
And, I think some of it is just reproduction and human nature, right? I mean, if you don't have a big family and if you have one or two kids and they're just not born with the passion for that or get a passion for doing something else, which was what actually happened in my mother's family, which is a shorter farming history in New Hampshire. It was 11 generations, but her father was an only child, and he got a real passion for going into education and became, a high school teacher and then went on to work at a graduate school of education. So that kind of broke the cycle there.
Yeah. Well, having passion for something probably is a luxury that's fairly new. Like you could be, passionate about something else in the 16th century and tough luck. I know you want to go fishing right now, but we're a farming family, so guess what you're going to do?
Yeah, there's truth to that. And there's truth, certainly for a lot of families around the world. And I don't know that I could speak to all of the conditions and thoughts affecting them, right? But, I do think one of the things that keeps in the modern era, so not over that whole 600-year history that we're referring to for my father's family in Norway, but in the modern era, one of the things that has helped maintain that continuity has been land use laws that require permanent residence on productive land. It cannot be a second home. It cannot be an investor-owned property. The person who owns the ground has to be living there. And then because for a variety of reasons, the Norwegian public has provided sort of good support to small-scale farms. So the standard of living for farmers is maintained on a relative par with other standards of living through subsidies and other public policy. They're still productive because that's actually another part of the land use law. You have to be a permanent resident and you have to produce something. So they're still productive. But, there's always that challenge today with other sectors of the economy generating, for a variety of reasons, higher returns on investment of labor and capital. So it can be attractive to move out of a sector that has lower potential returns, and often natural resources in the 20th and now in the 21st century is in that category. And I know here in Wallowa County, some analysis about 10 years ago showed that most of our working landscapes were probably worth 3 times or more if it was sold into some other land use, particularly into development.
Sure.
And the same would probably be true for the potential wage earnings of the people living there, right? A lot of people can make much higher wages if they did something else.
And that is attractive in the short term. But if you shift everyone, or even, most people, to that, pretty soon there's no food. There's no food for them to eat. So it doesn't matter how wizard they are with their computer skills or how entertaining they are for, a music video. We need people to produce food, and we need land for them to do it on. And that is going to always be important. We're down to 2 or 3% of the country in agriculture now.
Yeah, I think it's 2%. And 2%. And I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it's one of the things that is sort of both amusing and aggravating to me, I think, about urban sort of stereotypes and opinions. I don't know. I don't want to be stereotyping myself, but I'm not sure that everybody in the living and working in an urban area appreciates the benefit that they have because they don't need to worry about producing their own food. They don't need to worry about producing their own construction materials or their own fuel for heating. They're benefiting from the surplus of people living primarily in rural areas and allowing them to specialize in entertainment, in banking, in technology, and reap the rewards that our economy provides into those sectors. And if they wouldn't be able to spend that much time specializing if they actually had to produce their own food.
Of course.
Right? And so trying to figure out at the simplest level, how do we make sure appropriate value comes back to the landowner, land producer, the landowner, whether if it is the producer or not, because you want to keep that land as working land. You don't want it to convert it to something else. And the producer, obviously, whose sweat equity and other investment is key to providing the supply chains that make the rest of the economy hum.
Yeah.
That, I'm going to just add one other thing, which I think is obvious to both of us, is that the real value of both working lands and the people working on the land is far greater than the products that are produced. It is maintaining the basic ecosystem services that all of the public benefits from, and which we know increasingly are key to understanding and really gauging our response to changing environmental conditions and climate change, to understanding and responding to biodiversity loss, and maintaining the productive capacity to meet the needs of society for many generations into the future. That's on the people living. It's the 2% of the people that are living and working on 80% of America's lands that are key to that.
Right. Yeah. What do you mean by ecosystem services?
So I mean, yeah, it's a good question, right? I mean, we understand that a good functioning ecosystem is helping to maintain clean air, clean water, the productive capacity that whether it's crops or it's native plants and wildlife habitat, but also carbon sequestration. All of these things, and in particular, I think one of the things is just fresh water, right? But all of these things are provided by a healthy, functioning ecosystem. And generally speaking, neither the landowner or the producer can monetize those benefits. Those benefits are public goods that we all benefit from and are underappreciated in the marketplace today.
Yeah, access to clean air and clean water, pretty important.
Pretty important.
Pretty important.
Pretty important.
And without healthy ag systems, we can lose that much more quickly than what folks understand. Norway has a reputation of good natural resource management, and they've been interested in it for a long time. In particular, their reputation for forestry is very good. And you got involved in that at an early age, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about Norwegian forestry and what makes that special amongst forestry management plans throughout the world.
Yeah, I mean that's it. That's an interesting way of phrasing it. There's been a long history of people being part of the natural system and manipulating and managing the natural system, and I think there is a strong sense of environmental value and conservation value in Norway. But I would also say that they have also been, like we all are, susceptible to fads, trends in science, management, paradigms, and in forestry. I mean, it's called sort of German forestry. I'm not sure that's totally fair, but that's what we call it, and which is sort of a much more regulated, intensive, managed system, often even age systems, and Norway has done that for a while. I mean, the Norwegian forest systems were also dramatically altered by the English Empire in that the large coastal oak forests were harvested and pretty much transformed, and even some of the tallest, oldest spruce trees to as raw materials for the Royal Navy.
Right. And because they're slow-growing trees, they were very, very tough because it's in a colder climate, and but because of the Gulf Stream, you can actually still get a tree to grow up there.
Yeah.
And they made remarkable lumber for those ships, and those ships that were the Arctic explorers in the North Sea and in Antarctica that were dealing with crushing ice all the time. That wood tended to come from Norway.
Yeah. So that transformed the forest too. But in general, they have done a good job of protecting. The very first thing you want to do in any of these sort of ecotypes is maintain them, right? Don't lose them to some other land use, land cover type. And they've done a good job of keeping their forests as forests. And I think, as we all do over time, we learn and we evolve and we adapt and look for more species diversity, sort of less uniformity, more diversity in age classes and patterns across the landscape, and then the patterns of management. But they still do, small, even age management, but on a little bit smaller footprint than we do here. But they've also been really good at really trying to optimize and the utilization efficiency. So, when a tree is cut down, they're trying to get as close to 100% utilization of that woody biomass as they can.
Yeah. Which is great. We want to use as much of that tree as we can, and that's a great way to store carbon as well. If you're concerned about carbon, then using that wood material in construction or something is a great way to store it.
Yeah, especially when it's both as a construction material to store it, but that benefit is more clear too when you think about the alternatives for construction materials that are often much more carbon intensive. And and there's still a lot of debate about sort of carbon budgets and balances and use of different renewable resources like trees, but that debate is silly in comparison to the use of steel or concrete or many other construction materials, right? I mean, it's much more preferable to use renewable resources, to use wood, and really try to be thinking about circular economies as much as we can.
Circular economies. I don't know what that means.
It is. I mean, it's basically trying to think about more closed loop systems that we are prioritizing use of renewable resources versus non-renewable resources. We try to optimize, increase the efficiency of use. We try to reuse materials, repurpose and reuse things so that their life keeps getting extended. And those are kind of key principles to that. And you'll see it being referred to across a whole bunch of commercial sectors today that are really rethinking how can they minimize waste, minimize pollutants as outputs from their production process, and increase efficiency.
Yeah. If you should be one thing, be efficient.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Big fan of efficiency. You can get addicted to it though, and you can get so lasered in on efficiency that you can lose productivity in a way that becomes wildly inefficient. Yeah, I'm guilty of that sometimes. When did you get the call to, or the opportunity to go to Botswana?
So that was, I was working on a family forest north of Oslo in Norway, just outside of a town called Hakadal. And that forest had been in their family for many, many generations. I can't remember how long, but a very long time. And I was a field forester for them coming out of graduate school. And one night, the owner invited me in to have a beer with him after work. And he was on the board of the Norwegian Forestry Society. And the Norwegian Forestry Society had just won a contract with NORAD, to the Norwegian Agency for International Development, to provide a team to Botswana, to their Ministry of Forestry, to support a forest inventory and management project for 6 forest reserves across northern Botswana, totaling 3 million hectares. And they needed a field supervisor to lead the inventory team. So I put my name in the hat and eventually got selected, and the Norwegian Forestry Society sent me down to northern Botswana.
How obscure. Right? How unlikely is all of that? It's amazing. Okay, so what were some of the issues facing forestry in Botswana?
Well, in a much more extreme way, they're fairly similar to what we talk about here in the United States. So inadequate staff, inadequate equipment, inadequate budgets to manage the resource that they had responsibility for. And as we learned, that translated to inadequate understanding and information about the forest itself, right? What's in the forest? How many trees of what types of trees, what age class, what size class, what value? So when they're planning to do timber sale concessions, they often didn't actually fully understand the value themselves. And so, the bidders were getting a really good deal.
Okay.
And
which exploitation of natural resources in Africa is as old as people going to Africa who are not from there.
Correct.
Yeah.
But it happens everywhere. It happens in the United States too, and particularly has happened to small landowners, whether they're farmers or forest landowners or ranchers in America. True.
Yeah.
So that was an amazing experience for me, both leading a team of Botswana from 3 different tribes in that area, with a sort of a deputy who was from Zimbabwe, who was and had learned his forestry in Russia during the Zimbabwe Wars for Independence.
So was it Zimbabwe or Rhodesia at the time?
When I was there, it was Zimbabwe.
Okay.
So, yeah, they had already won. And so just leading a sort of a very multicultural, ethnically diverse team and being kind of the oddball, being the white man.
Yeah.
But in this vast landscape with very few people, incredible amounts of wildlife. The wildlife experience, from big game to birds to, fruits and berries to all kinds of nasty snakes was incredible. And part of the issue, as I got, more and more, because I ended up spending almost 7 years in Southern Africa in different capacities, but, more and more I just began to understand and appreciate the sort of complex historical and current dynamic of rural community life in these landscapes and how their relationship with that natural environment had changed through the colonial era and post-independence era. And then there was just a lot of experimentation going on with new forms of partnership to advance conservation goals, but in lockstep with economic development, public health, public education goals across these rural places.
What does timber harvest look like in Botswana, or what did it look like then? I bet it was
very simple. So
yeah.
it was hand felling with crews of people that would roll the logs up ramps onto flatbed trucks.
Wow.
Yeah.
I was very impressed by the machete and axe handling skills of the Maasai that I worked with in Tanzania. Phenomenal.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I would let those guys do surgery on me with those tools if they were doctors, It was so precise. Like, for example, when we were butchering a Cape buffalo, they used an axe to quarter that animal, and they were able to cut through the hide and fat and ribs going down the side of that animal without puncturing the intestines.
Yeah, it's incredible.
That is phenomenal to be able to do with an axe. Yeah. And, when we were blazing trails driving past, one of them would take a swipe up and the other one would take a swipe down with a machete going 20 miles an hour on the same tree and be able to blaze a tree doing that.
Right.
It's phenomenal.
Yeah.
And, cutting out airstrips in the bush with machetes, like cutting down trees with a knife. The skill and the labor that is required to conduct forestry like that, it's beyond what we can really fathom.
Yeah. I mean, they were, in my experience, they actually were using chainsaws.
Okay.
But that was, chainsaw and the flatbed truck were sort of the limits of, at least where I was, the limits of sort of the mechanized logging. Yeah. The rest was all hand labor.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah.
Talk to me about how you ended up advocating for, I guess, the usage of wildlife in that area.
I mean, like in so many places, but I'll speak specifically to Southern Africa as I understood it. And again, I have about 7 years there, so I'm by no means an expert.
Sure.
It's a very small snapshot in time where I tried to learn as much as I could, but I don't consider myself an expert. So take this all with a grain of salt. But, you have the colonial legacy of imposing by the colonial powers national parks, game reserves, primarily for the benefit of the colonialists and their sort of other elite partners in place that transform historical co-evolved relationships of people and wildlife and landscape. And then as populations grow, as we've improved nutrition and as we improve healthcare and populations grow, you have increasing pressure on land use. and inevitably you have more conflict, right? You have more human-wildlife conflict. And in a situation where the cultural, spiritual, and sort of broader economic relationships, social economic or cultural economic relationships between people and wildlife have been broken, wildlife is it's easy to sort of just say it's either food or it's a threat, rather than the more complex relationship that existed in the past. And so there was an incentive over time, particularly for large game like elephant, that were increasingly damaging their food crops and their food granaries. There was an incentive to try to get rid of them, right? Because it was a pest, right? It was problem animal control.
I mean, pest is a little bit light, if we're being honest, right? If a mouse breaks into your Wheaties, that's a pest. If an elephant comes in and destroys your entire year's worth of crop one night, a herd of elephants, and then they destroy your house and then maybe kill someone in the process, that's something different from a pest.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Thank
you.
And that's the reality of what's happening.
That is the reality of what they were dealing with. And because of that, the Southern African, a whole combination of people in Southern Africa, from university leaders, national park leaders, conservation group leaders, landowners, village leaders, concocted this program that had first been tried on private ranches to delegate more rights and authority over wildlife management and utilization to rural communities, but with clear sideboards.
Yep.
Clear sideboards that protected the species and sort of guided the trajectory towards broader national conservation goals, but gave them some flexibility in trying to figure out the best way to do that, and also ensuring that conservation generated direct incentives back to them. For example, if they decided within whatever bounds of hunting quota that they were allowed to just make decisions over, if they decided to sell some part of that to a safari operator, the majority of that revenue came back to the village.
Mm-hmm.
And so immediately it changed that dynamic. Right now we're not talking about just a threat. It can still be a threat, but now it actually is bringing money to the community that is far in excess of their other earning opportunities.
Right.
And it creates cash that allows them to invest in schools and healthcare facilities, in new clean water facilities. And they also had a lot of partnerships to put in place protective measures and non-lethal control. So electric fences to protect their food crops and granaries. And they just experimented with a lot of different ways to sort of reestablish more coexistence. Again, recognizing that we're talking about land that over time has been subdivided into a variety of properties and fence lines. So it's not the same historical landscape that their cultures and societies had evolved in. And under the current context, trying to figure out how to protect them with electric fences and other deterrent measures seemed to be working. So that, plus the economic incentives, you saw this massive reduction in poaching rates. You saw some of the fastest increases in populations for African elephant, black rhino on the continent. And you saw household incomes rise and living standards rise all together, right? That was super inspiring to me. I mean, that's actually what inspired me on the journey that eventually led me here to Wallowa County.
And the engine that drove that is recreational hunting.
That was the primary, the initial driver. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an amazing thing. And it's hard for people to understand that. It's hard for people to say, well, why do you have to go and hunt elephant and pay this money in order for this to all happen? And the short answer is that nobody else is willing to pay the money. Nobody else is willing to go down there and say, here's $100,000 because I care about elephants and I want nothing in return.
Or if they do, it doesn't come back to the village.
Right.
Right?
Right.
It goes to a large conservation organization or to a government entity that addresses needs, but it doesn't come back to the village, right? It doesn't change the dynamic and the sort of algorithm within the village about sort of opportunities, costs, benefits in the same way that this arrangement did.
Yeah. Another interesting one, when I was living in Norway and starting to learn Norwegian, one of my favorite things to do was to go to the grocery stores, and it was a great place for me to learn because I could see the item and know what it was and then see the word written on it. And I had time to be able to process all that. It wasn't like it was in conversation or watching television or something like that where you only have a fleeting moment to understand. Like now I can look at, a fish and I can find the word fish and translate it all in my mind and build it up. It was a library of learning for me. And I came across a piece of meat that I could not recognize. And meat is kind of my thing. I was like, what is this? And I learned the word, and I was looking at whale meat that was for sale in the grocery store. I was like, could this be legal? It was inconceivable, I couldn't believe that I was looking at whale meat for sale in a grocery store. But that's a common enough thing in Norway because Norwegians still hunt whales.
Yeah, not very many.
Yeah.
And I don't know that it's extremely common, but if you're looking for it, you can find it.
Yeah.
And it's definitely sort of diminished in practice, both hunting whales and eating whale meat. But it is still practiced. And for Norwegians, like for many people, many coastal people, particularly for me that I'm familiar with in the Arctic region, it's part of a long-standing seasonal lifestyle, really.
Yeah.
And, here, it's not all that different. I mean, it seems different today, and people may find it wrong of me to make this comparison, but I'm going to make it anyways, right? When we listen here to the Nez Perce tribe or the Confederated tribes talk about their culture, their traditions, and a lot of it is based on the seasonal cycle of food that's important to their people. Right. In many parts of the Arctic, from northern Norway, Greenland, Iceland, Canada, Alaska, etc., there were periods of time that whale populations would pass close enough to the coast, and it was a defined period of time, and they would hunt whale, and that was a key part of providing for their families and their villages enough food.
And not just food, but also light.
Correct.
Right. Shelters.
Right.
All the things made out of whale bones are incredible. If
Correct.
you look at Inuits and Aleuts especially, they would build everything out of whales.
Right.
And it was just this glimpse in the year where that was available. And then what a challenge to go out there with a spear.
With very primitive tools again.
In a kayak.
Right.
And then you've got some bladders that are filled up with air that are made out of a seal's stomach that is going to slow this whale down. And you might be out on the ocean for 3 or 4 days and nights following this whale around and then trying to tow it back to your village again in kayaks. Like, oh my God, it's incredible.
Yeah.
But that is a critical part of people being able to populate North America in particular after the Pleistocene in the last 14,000 years. If we weren't able to hunt whales, we probably don't make it. There's a few like really keystone species that allowed people to survive, for the period of time that they were stuck in Alaska before the ice sheets receded and they were able to continue south. And whales were a big part of that. And the same thing in Norway.
Yeah. And all across that region. Yeah.
So if you're having a conversation with somebody about about whale harvest or about elephant harvest, and the hunting of these animals that people have such strong emotional connections to, but maybe very little understanding about the ecological impacts of. How do you have those conversations? It's tough.
It's really tough. I mean, it's particularly tough when you're talking about, you know, what we often refer to as charismatic megafauna now, right? And certainly whales and elephants are seem to be at the top of that order.
Sure.
And so it's an extremely difficult conversation, and it's made more difficult by the fact that as we moved into the industrial era, we invented better tools and technology to hunt these animals,
right,
and we got more efficient at it. And we didn't have, you know, proper understanding of their populations and dynamics, and often was dramatic amounts of overharvest. So that history makes it difficult too. That all being said, when we talk about global biodiversity conservation, the biggest threat is land use change, right? So habitat loss because of land use change, in addition to pollution, invasive species, climate change. Those issues in most places, and there are places and individual species where direct harvest is still the primary threat today, and we need to address that. But sort of at a global aggregate level, those other dynamics are the most important ones for us to consider. And when you think about land use change and habitat loss, you know, you have to immediately think about, okay, what are we eating today as humans? And we're eating, you know, something like 3 or 4 primary sources of meat and protein, and 4 or 5 primary sources of grains. And you could go on with sources of oil and whatever. I mean, food oil, crop, you know. And we're converting massive amounts of natural habitat to produce these things, often in monocrops or in concentrated sort of production systems.
Which comes back to that subject of efficiency. Like, we want to be efficient, right? It is inefficient to put a field of, you know, a dozen different crops in the same piece of ground. You put in one crop, and then you can treat it all the same, and then you can harvest it efficiently. Otherwise, it becomes very, very expensive. You can't just have a garden, you know? So it's hard. How are we going to feed all these people? There's so many people and so few of us that are trying to produce the food. How do we do it? Well, can it be done?
Yeah, I think it can be done. But I think, you know, I think that, you know, that also goes back to the earlier conversation about ecosystem services and benefits, and sort of what sort of incentives and training and technology are we providing to people that are producing food for us.
And the age of producers. I've talked about it before on the show,
right.
But 57 and a half years
right.
old,
right.
average age of someone in agriculture. That's such a problem.
It is.
So how do you entice somebody who is 20 to get into agriculture when it's almost impossible to buy the ground and then get that money back from it? The work is crippling, literally. Like, we have this really big problem in the short term. How do we deal with this?
I mean, you know, some people are still attracted into these fields the way they're designed today. But I agree with you, right? I think we need to get more creative. We need to get more innovative. And when you look at young people today, and I mean, this may be my own bias, but my sense of when I look at my kids and their friends, and I interact with high school and university students around the Pacific Northwest, my sense is, you know, they've heard so much doom and gloom and so much dystopia that they're really keen for a message of hope and positive action, and that we need to be talking about more than just producing food, right? We need to be talking about empowering people and supporting people to get into agriculture, ranching, forestry in a way that is also sequestering carbon, and providing for wildlife habitat and being more creative in the way we solve these challenges rather than just producing widgets, right? Trying to be going back to efficiency, right? Just rather than just trying to be the most efficient producer of bushels per acre. And as you said, it's important, but generally speaking, the United States produces a surplus of food, and not all of it is making it to efficient consumption either, right? And so there's an opportunity there to rethink, to what degree is there truly efficiency through this system? There may be efficiency on the production side at the land side, but if it all ends up rotting in storage because it never makes it to an end user, that's not an efficient system.
Yep.
Right? And obviously it doesn't all do that, but there is waste in the system.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And then, exporting some of these goods is pretty costly in terms of, just the cost, but also the cost of the environment. When we're barging these foods to other continents, there's a pretty serious toll to the environment.
There's a toll to the environment there, and it's also sort of an economic factor affecting decisions in those other places, right?
Sure.
If we are shipping cheap food someplace else, to what degree is that undermining the economics of farming, ranching, forestry in that place?
Which is, an excellent reason to have country of origin labels on the food that we have here, so that people know whether this is cheap food that came from Brazil or was this beef raised in Oregon.
Yeah. And that's, and I'm not, I'm not an expert in Norwegian ag and trade policy, but what I've always understood that's an interesting thing in Norway is that when Norwegian when the crops are ready for harvest, whatever it is, and just there's an apple on my desk, so apples are ready for harvest, or strawberries are ready for harvest, or potatoes are ready for harvest. For a period of time, the tariffs go up on imported food, so that the locally produced food, even though it's probably more expensive than that food coming in from overseas, because our labor costs are higher, right? Yeah. There's higher taxes on a whole range of the supply chains, that tariffs go up so that you're encouraged to buy locally produced food. And then when that local supply is done, the tariffs come down so you can buy the imported goods at whatever that normal price would have been.
Interesting.
And it's an interesting way to do it, right? Because particularly in Norway with a short growing season, they're not going to meet everybody's needs year round.
Yeah. Yeah. At least not if you want to eat a fresh apple every day of the year.
No, correct. And I'm glad you said that, because, that was one of the things that's come out of when people are looking at, okay, how could we really encourage society both to meet their nutritional needs and sort of improve standards of living, but, contribute to biodiversity conservation. One of the key things that people said is we need to diversify our food sources. And a key thing there too is ideally to hunt, harvest, gather more from natural habitats, rather than rely on converting them to,
Yeah. Eating seasonally is great. And then you get into these cold climates where if you want to eat without food preservation, like what are you going to do?
Right.
So it's an interesting thing, and there's problems that come with folks who are not nomadic anymore. We used to have to move with the food, and with agriculture, we were able to, keep our food with us and sit still and let the seasons blow over the top of us, and that really changed the game.
And it certainly does for, going back to urban areas, right? So, the western U.S. is the most urbanized region in the United States. I think it's well over 80% of the people live in urban areas. And
interesting.
And they're oblivious to the seasonal changes.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Everything's climate controlled, baby.
Right.
Yeah. No, it's funny. Japan has some massive problems with urbanization right now, and they have a huge number of bear attacks there's several bear species in Japan, and there's this I am legend thing going on in rural Japan where all the kids have moved to town to take higher paying jobs. They don't want to work on the farm. We've left very old people in agriculture there, and then the animals have kind of taken over the place, and they have 10 times as many bear attacks in little tiny Japan as we do in all of North America.
Wow.
Every year.
It's incredible.
Insane.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So that could be a preview of coming attractions for us.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah, we'll see.
Huh.
The difference between conservation and preservation is a subject that you and I have talked about before. Conservation is a tricky word because lots of people use it, but they use it differently. It means something different to them. So how do you define conservation, and then how do you contrast that with preservation?
So, I mean, one of the things, as I mentioned before, I worked in Southern Africa for about 7 years, but I worked in Europe and Australia and other places. So all told, I was overseas for about 13, 14 years, working in a whole range of natural resource conservation fields and jobs, wildlife, forestry, ranching, but also at a policy level in Brussels with the European Union. And internationally, the conservation community writ large understands the word conservation to have three key components. The first, obviously, is the conservation of biodiversity at the ecosystem, species, and genetic level. The second is the sustainable use of that biodiversity to meet our needs. And the sustainable part of it, sustainable use, is key, right? Because you're looking to maintain that opportunity to use those resources for future generations. And the third part of conservation is the equitable distribution of benefits from both the conservation activities and the use activities. And that's what leads to durable conservation.
That sounds like the toughest trick of all.
Correct.
Yeah.
Totally the toughest trick. And when I came back to the U.S., it struck me that we weren't really grappling with all the dimensions of conservation. And too often we were just it wasn't that we just couldn't grapple with that third piece, the equitable distribution of benefits. We weren't really grappling with the sustainable use piece. The conservation conversation was primarily focused on conserving biodiversity at the ecosystem, species, and genetic level, and not recognizing that if we're not also talking about sustainable use, the forces that the other options to produce food, wood products, energy are going to conflict with your conservation goals unless you can figure out ways to get alignment. And then, as we talked about, that third piece is key, that the conservation strategies and the use strategies need to be equitable for them to be durable long term. And we see that in the United States all the time as the politics for or against conservation shift, right? They can shift sort of with generations, they can shift with political parties, they can shift for a lot of different reasons, but they're not very durable because there isn't that sort of alignment on vision, values, and ethics. But part of that's because there just isn't equity in the system as we've designed it today.
And how critical is equity to that durability?
I think it's absolutely critical. People aren't vested in sort of the decisions that translate themselves to policies and market conditions, land use plans and designations, and on down the line. If people aren't vested in that, and particularly if they see themselves as losing out, they fight against it. If everybody's benefiting, right, it's in all our interest to maintain that status quo. And I think that's one of the visions too that came with me from working in Southern Africa, because it was that vision that we figure out a way to get us all aligned with a vision and the belief that conservation, use, human prosperity were not exclusive, mutually exclusive, right? This wasn't a zero-sum game, right? That we actually could practice in our daily lives and as communities and estates and countries conservation in a way that would maintain and continue to improve our standards of living, provide jobs, provide dignity, reduce conflict. And we're still struggling to get there. And that it's, if you go back and read Aldo Leopold, he talked about this in an essay in 1935, I think. He talked about how odd it was that in America that we divide up the disciplines and advocates for natural sciences and social sciences, and that they became exclusive spheres of political thought and education. And he said the greatest conservation achievement of that century, this is written in 1935, would be if we could find alignment. And we're still struggling to find that integration and alignment.
Yeah. There's very few people who are interested in both things. Do you think that's an exclusively American problem?
I wouldn't say it's exclusively American, but I think there's a lot more people in other countries that I've worked in, both in Europe and in Africa, that understand the essential need for that integration.
What were some of the issues that you were dealing with in Australia? This show has a large Australian audience. I love those guys. So
really?
I'd like to hear about.
So, my time in Australia, I loved my time in Australia, but it was brief, but it was a joy. And the most impactful experience for me was working on the Burenda sheep station outside of Agathella in Queensland. So we're talking about approximately 800 Ks or 500 miles west of Brisbane.
Okay.
And it was, if my memory strikes me, because I was a younger man then, I think it was about 250,000 acres and 21,000 merino sheep and about 500 head of cows, mixed a variety of drought sort of resistant breeds like Simmental, Brahman, Hereford, Brofords, Simbras, and what I can remember is sort of the impact of sheep ranches and all the watering systems that were developed that allowed other wildlife to move in much larger numbers onto the sheep stations and other farms and ranch systems that create new conflicts again, right? So in particular, there was a huge number of kangaroos that are competing for forage. And like there have been, I learned subsequently, for hundreds of years, there have been, roo hunters that are go out and shoot kangaroos. And I think historically we probably did a better job of fully utilizing them again, ensuring that the meat and skin and everything else was used. In this case, it was primarily the hides that were being harvested for leather work, and not very much of the meat was utilized. So,
well, utilized by humans.
Yeah, although it was left in sort of big piles, and it quickly. You're right. There were scavengers that. But
it always gets used. It just doesn't always get used by us. I think there's a degree of hubris in that.
No, that's fair.
I find that within hunting quite often that people will wound an animal and lose it, and they'll say, "Oh, what a waste." Well, no, it's not a waste. That got utilized by 50 ravens and 3 eagles and 6 coyotes and 29 trillion bacteria. It's not wasted. It's just not utilized by us.
Right.
And maybe it is down the road, but not directly. It's just carbon cycle.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I that experience was phenomenal for me. Everything about it. I was actually just talking to the sheep station manager, a guy named Peter McGregor. Well, he and I were talking the other day because he had I think it was his 70th birthday recently. And now he lives down on the Murray River in New South Wales. And he was remembering that when my time was up on the sheep station, he arranged for transportation for me back to Brisbane, that he came out and found me, and I was on horseback gathering cattle, and he said, I think he said in pasture number 1 or whatever, and he said, I found you a ride, and he said that I looked him in the eye, and he said I wasn't ready to go yet. And it was just it was a great family. For me, it was a great way of life. I was learning all of the time. And going back to that conversation about kangaroos, that, I was thinking too about, like, how could we set up the systems that would allow for more multi-species management, so that we manage kangaroo in a different way, right?
Yeah.
And that we did utilize the meat, right? And we did utilize it, and it just became another product of that landscape, rather than, again, sort of just and in this case, a pest, a nuisance, or a competitor for forage, right? And that's kind of like the same discussion we have here in Wallowa County about elk, right?
Yeah.
Elk competing for forage with the livestock producers. And that, it's so odd to me, right? Like, how come we can't fix that dynamic so that a landowner could benefit equally by having elk on their ground as cows? And in Zimbabwe, in Southern Africa, the key thing was to change the notion that wildlife would be treated differently than domestic animals, and that a landowner or a village could actually benefit from that.
Yeah. The Maui Nui Venison Company, you know about those guys in Hawaii? Maui has what is now a problem with axis deer. They've got about 60,000 head of axis deer on the island. And in areas, they're really hard on their native plants and on crops and golf courses and a number of other things. So the Maui Nui Venison Company is the first place that has USDA inspected wild game that is hunted.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So it's happening in Maui.
Right.
Like, we've already figured it out at the federal level with those guys. Now, that's an invasive species. There's an argument to be made about the elk that we have here being an invasive species, because they were certainly brought here. We have got all the documentation of that. Are they the same elk that we had here prior to that? Maybe, maybe not. Probably not. Close enough. Doesn't matter. But we have the model in place there. It could be done. We've just got to figure it out. But finding ways for a landowner to benefit from having elk on their place, it's certainly possible, but it is going to include harvest.
Oh yeah, no, and I mean, I think it should again, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think if we're thinking about,
it's a sustainable resource. Why not?
We want to diversify our food source. It's a good source of highly nutritious meat, and we want to, and not just diversify our food sources, but think about what's best adapted to and contributing to the rest of that system. And in different places, that's going to be different animals.
Yeah.
And again, thinking about the evolution of community-based natural resource management in Southern Africa, and also sort of the evolution of cattle ranches to become game conservancies in Southern Africa. There was a lot of analysis done while I was there. Ranchers hired
Marketing firm?
an auditing firm, financial firm. Yeah, and they put together a team to do pretty in-depth analysis of kind of the environmental and economic costs and benefits of different land management strategies, and compared the current returns to the landowner of livestock production and sale with a mixed system of wildlife, livestock, and in some places they also added a variety of food crops, farm crops. And inevitably this analysis just showed that, long term there would be better returns to the farmer from a multi-species system than a single species, i.e. cows, and that it would be, more resilient in the face of changing market conditions, changing precipitation and drought, cycles of drought, that there would be more resilience in the system of adopting a multi-species system. But it did rely, part of their analysis always included some element of safari hunting as a key source of additional revenue, as well as photographic safaris and sort of foot safaris, which I did at one place. It was amazing because we got to track rhino on foot through the bush all day long, and it was just an incredible experience. But the places that did that, and I'm thinking now about like the Save Conservancy, there's pictures from those. There was like 21 ranches, contiguous ranches, that banded together, wrote a common constitution binding their management together. They tore down all the internal fences, put up one perimeter fence because they did still have livestock, so there was protection about foot and mouth disease. But they introduced a lot of wildlife into that system and reduced the number of cows. I don't know what the overall number of ungulates, how that changed. But with more diversity and also better rains, the rapid response of native grasses, shrubs, other vegetation, and associated wildlife, including, a whole range of bird species, was dramatic.
Yeah.
Really, really dramatic and exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of other examples where it's sort of happening in the lower 48, and that's bison, right? We have bison hunts. We have bison that are acting more or less wild within the confines of the acreage that they're on. And then we have bison that are commercially harvested that can be USDA inspected and sold.
Right. That's a very similar thing, right? Because a lot of the conservancies, part of their revenue was safari hunting, part was photographic, but they also did auctions when they had surplus animals. Mm-hmm. Another option was just to sell them to some other place that was looking to stock up. So it was contributing to
genetic diversity as well.
And resurgence in that species across a larger land area, right?
Yeah. I mean, Texas is a beautiful example of that, where there are multiple species that are in high fence areas in Texas that are now, they went extinct in their native habitat, and they were able to reintroduce them because they had healthy populations in Texas from hunting.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool.
Yeah.
But yeah. Well, if people have thoughts or comments or questions, can they get a hold of you? Is there a way that they can follow along in the life of Nils Christoffersen?
Yeah, no, they can, although I'm not big on social media or anything, but you can follow our work at our website for Wallowa Resources, where I work. Yep. So that's wallowaresources.org. I do have a LinkedIn profile. I'd probably use that more than anything else. I am on another, but that's probably where you would find me, or you can call me at the office. Be happy to talk.
We'll put some links to that stuff down below. Wallowa Resources has been an enduring effort throughout my life here to advocate for natural resources, for agriculture, for the use of those things in a sustainable way. Thank you for what you do. I know it is a tough fight.
Appreciate that,
with short gains a lot of times, but you're the right man for it, and you come at it from a worldly perspective. It's very interesting.
Yeah, well, I thank you, and it's a team effort here that starts with the people in this community and the landowners and producers here, and we try to be a positive addition to an incredible community that I think shares this vision that our people and our natural resources are the two most important values of this place, and we need to ensure that we're caring for each other, right? That we're caring for the natural resources, and that the natural resources are able to provide for our care.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's how it works.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thanks, James.
What I remember is getting up in the dark, shuffling on out to the pickup and climbing in, heading out, headlights going out over the fields and the roads and getting back into the mountains and the timber, and knowing that there was a destination out there that I was going to be sharing with my dad. And at some point, either during the drive or once we got out to some ridge that we were going to be watching when the sun came up, you'd hear that little squeak of the lid coming off of the thermos. And then you unscrew that top part a little bit, pour that coffee or hot chocolate into a cup, and you can just see the little tiny vapors of steam coming off of it, curling up into the morning, and holding on to that thing like it was a prayer, and blowing some of the heat off of it and taking that first hot drink in the morning, and then the same thing that evening, because if there was anything left, it was still going to be hot. Like, those are core memories. Those are part of growing up and part of being an adult, and then sharing that. Now, I'm getting to share that with my nephew and giving him those experiences. And it's an accessory to the experience. But part of what I remember about hunting and working with my family as a little kid was that there was this green, beat to hell, still going strong Stanley thermos. And now there's a complete line of Stanley products out there. And if you go to stanley1913.com, you can look into those and see if there's something out there that you need, or that you want, or that you would like to give to somebody else. And if you use the discount code 6RANCH, the number 6 and the word ranch, and you can get 25% off of just about anything in their store. I encourage you to do it. They're great supporters of this show. They're great supporters of this audience. I love you guys. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for all of your support and your attention. We're not stopping. We're going strong. And I'm glad to pass along this discount to you guys. And I hope that you find something that can help develop that core memory for you and the people that you love. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share the show with a friend. You can also rate the podcast and leave a review. Your support allows me to keep doing what I love, which is meeting incredible folks and sharing their stories with you. For more content and photos, follow the show on Instagram at 6Ranch Podcast or me at 6Ranch Outfitters. This episode was produced by Emily Brannigan, with original music written and performed by Justin Hay. Art for the 6Ranch Podcast was created by John Chatelain and digitized by Nils Christoffersen. Tune in every Monday for a brand new episode of the 6Ranch Podcast. I'll catch you next week.